Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. Today I'm joined by Steve Wilcock, who is an expert in the realm of fire safety, a topic that obviously is one that's very important and one we haven't covered that much on the podcast. So it was great to get Steve on and have a chat. We talk a bit about Steve's background. We talk about Grenfell, as you'd expect when it comes to fire, and then what's been going on in the world in terms of perception of risk, changes, legislative improvements, and also different trends. So, lithium-ion batteries, for example, heightening risk. And it's really interesting to kind of meander through what's been happening in the world of fire. Steve will also share the new app that he's developed that might be of interest if you are managing fire safety within your business. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you do, give us a like, a comment, a share, a subscribe, and all of that good stuff. Be very much appreciated. And hope you enjoyed this episode with myself and Steve Wilcock. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Steve.
Good morning, Christian.
How are we doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, all the better for being on the pod.
There we go. Yeah,
conversation about fire. My favorite
fire.
subject.
Yeah, fire. My youngest son's just learning about the Great Fire of London at school.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah.
So
yeah.
He's coming home and singing about fire all the time.
Awesome. Yeah, the fascination. Children and fire has always been a fascination. It's been around for a while, so it's a big subject.
It has. It's definitely been around for a while, and it can cause a lot of damage, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. I was interested, Steve, looking at your background. You were in the Royal Navy, weren't you, as a Sea Harrier engineer? How did that kind of shape your approach to problem solving, teamwork, and all of these other things that would have been relevant, I'm sure, in your kind of firefighting career?
Well, it was interesting that because I often cite being in the Royal Navy as a brilliant stepping stone to integrate into the fire service. Because all the fundamentals are in place. You're almost pushed through into a mold and forced into a mold at a very young, impressionable age during your formative years. You know, I was 18 when I joined the Royal Navy, and you are forced into team environments and forced to collaborate. There's stringent rules to follow, and there's almost like a zero tolerance. Right at the outset, in fact, it's just you say jump and I jump out. You know, I'll jump as high as I'm required to. You know, and then it's only as you start to bed in, you start to realise that you've got influence and opinion. And really, for me, I suppose it was all those fundamentals about working as a team. And working in a structured environment with a managerial hierarchy, if you will. And, you know, I think it teaches you a lot. It makes you very emotionally independent. I wouldn't say in other areas, because, of course, a lot of things are looked at, you know, your accommodation sorted, your food sorted. You're not truly independent, but you are a very long way from home for long periods of time. And I think it was... I think the fire service, the rank structure within the fire service is actually based on the naval sort of structure.
Okay.
And the uniforms are very similar as well. So it was when I arrived in the fire service, it was the only difference was we were going out to emergency incidents, but it just felt like a very familiar setting, certainly.
Yeah.
And a lot of ex-military guys and girls, you know, obviously, you know, gravitate towards the police stroke fire, having a period of time in the military. But yeah, definitely paved the way. Yeah.
Because I've done neither things, right? So I'm not speaking from an area of any expertise, but I imagine that there's a lot of similarities in that. You know, if you're on an operation in either setting, you've got to work as that harmonious team, because if one person does the wrong thing, then that can be disastrous.
Well, it can, and I think it's interesting how society's changed, I suppose, a little bit, because in some ways there's a danger in not speaking up. When I first joined the fight, you just blindly do as you were told, and as a sort of my career continued, you realise you'd be if you were making decisions, because I ended up in charge, in a sort of managerial position within the fire service, and actually, you can't see everything yourself, and you want that feedback from people. I don't want someone to blindly do something. I do want that something to come back to. Have you considered this? I think, oh right, that's a good point. But I think there's always a danger there if you've got young people who, certainly when I joined the Navy, it was blind obedience, and sometimes you would do things and you'd question, how safe is this? But it's a different set of rules in the military than in the Navy. Back in those days, of course. I think there was a lot of exemptions for forces staff. I actually listened to a recent podcast about a guy that was working in the air side that you did recently, and but that sort of connected with me. But it's interesting, interesting path. But you grow and grow throughout your career. And I think you become, very, very good in the fire service. Certainly, it's very, very experiential as a profession, and you become probably the best you'll ever be in your last sort of third of your career, because you've kind of built all that experience up. And unfortunately, you end up leaving and you take all that experience with you. And fire services aren't as they are. There's a daily grind there, but they're not as busy as they were 30 years ago for many reasons.
I always remember Tony Blair saying that as Prime Minister, you start off being the most popular you're ever going to be, but you know nothing, and then you finish off really knowing what you're doing, but you're the most unpopular.
Yeah.
And not to say that you're unpopular when you leave the fire service, but there's kind of an analogy there about how actually, you've got that skill just as and you're performing at your peak, I suppose, in many ways, just as you're finishing up.
I don't think there's a safe path to tread, which means that you're going to be always popular and always make the right decisions, because there's not that connection between the two. But I think that I think if you've got a listening ear and you explain and you're transparent, and I've always said. I remember doing an exercise, actually. I used to do a lot of exercises in the fire service. One was the lunar landing exercise, or the beach, where you're stranded on a beach, was another one where you have a priority list of 20 items. And we would get everybody to do this exercise as an individual, and then we would do the same exercise as a group. And actually, the group answer was always better than any single individuals, because you had that time for collaboration. So you've got that management sort of thing with Tannenbaum and Schmidt about different types of managerial style. Some people are very autocratic, and some people are very democratic. They'll have that conversation, and you've got to learn to slide up and down that scale. In an emergency situation, you haven't got time for discussion. Sometimes you just have to make split-second decisions, and hopefully you've factored everything in, and on a fire station, it might be something very, it might be something quite lame. What training exercise do you want to do next week? And we have a discussion, and we can have that collaboration. And I think that's where you build your value and build your trust. But in dynamic situations, sometimes you just don't have that opportunity to interact, and you have to make a decision. And it's much better in some cases to make a decision and show strong leadership than actually sitting on the fence and not making a decision. At least you're making an informed decision based on experience and obviously procedural guidance and stuff. But yeah, it's a strange. For many years, I used to think it's a really strange job being in the fire service. Being plucked out of one sort of environment and immersed within just a handful of minutes into a very dynamic setting, and having to engage your brain. And I really enjoyed it. And it's exciting. There's a lot of adrenaline involved, and of course, Greater Manchester, where I worked, it was a very busy brigade. It's it's one of the busiest brigades in the country. So there was a continual immersion in that. And we've got 41 fire stations, and 36 of them are whole time. Most brigades would have lots of retained and rural areas, and they're not getting the frequency of fires that you might get in a metropolitan brigade. But definitely an interesting career. Definitely developmental opportunities there for sure.
Yeah. And how does it feel to sort of have to make those split-second decisions and
Well,
have that weight of responsibility?
Well, it's sometimes I remember. I mean, there was one particular. You can pick probably a handful of things that have happened in your career that you really felt like you were on the ropes. I remember going to a road traffic collision probably about 15, 16 years ago, and we had a person trapped in that vehicle, and they wanted to take this to get this guy off. The only way to get him out was to remove his legs, and there was an EMAP team there, emergency team, that were saying, look, and it's called elective dismemberment, which is very, a bit unsettling. That's the only way to come out. And we decided. I remember seeing the CCTV with the clients. I was there rubbing my chin like this, and people saying, what's happening? What's happening? I thought, good grief, I've got to come up with a strategy here. And we decided to use some pulleys, and we stretched the car straight. We attached pulleys to the street furniture and literally jacked the car straight again, and it unfolded, opened up like and stretched down. This guy came out, and he was walking a couple of years later. And but I remember just looking at my team saying, well, come on, Steve, what are we doing? And just this idea, it wasn't part of any formal sort of strategy. It was just seemed like a very practical thing to do at the time. But very occasionally you do feel this enormity of having to make a decision. Now in Greater Manchester, we're quite lucky because we have a lot of it's a very busy brigade. We've got flexi duty staff. You've got officers that will turn up. And very quickly, you've got that collaboration there. So you've got that support. But in rural brigades, you might turn up as a watch manager in charge of a domestic or something like that. You might not be as experienced, but the station manager, the group manager, may be 25 minutes away, half an hour away. So it does fall on your shoulders. In GMC, within 6 or 7 or 8 minutes, sometimes you can find you've got that support there very quickly. So when you get these escalating incidents, often the baton's passed up the food chain. But it depends how dynamic things are. And I think the most important thing is to be introspective and think and reflect. What went well, what went badly, what might I do different next time, and the importance of debriefing. This is all part of that sort of developmental process, really. But yeah.
I mean, it's a big burden. So thank you for having done that on behalf of society for all those years.
Many people do. Yeah.
No, exactly. So we can't speak about fire without talking about Grenfell. Just interested to get your reflections on that. In particular, I suppose, do you feel like that has had an effect on the understanding or importance placed on fire safety? And then what do you kind of think of some of the changes that have happened as a result?
Well, so Grenfell absolutely put fire on the map. I remember that morning watching those images on the TV. In my patch, I started out in Salford, which was lots and lots of high rises.
Yeah, there are.
Our procedural guidance is pretty much nailed on, and it's we've got certain roles, certain tasks, certain equipment, and everything is built around the importance of the passive measures of the building. So in terms of fire compartmentation, we talk about the fixed installations that assist firefighters, such as the dry risers, which are basically pipes that you charge, and everything that is there. It means that we can put in place a procedure which allows us to tackle a fire, and it would normally stay and retain in that single compartment, and it will run like clockwork. When I saw those images that morning, I was astonished. I was absolutely stunned. And because when we think about when fires happen, there's a big focus from lay people out there. What was the cause of the fire? That's the question that people ask. And actually, that's quite short-sighted. Fires start all the time. What was the cause of the fire is always part of the deal. It's part of the investigation. But for me, it's the wider picture. What were the contributory factors which allowed a single candle-sized flame essentially to grow to what this is? What were the failings? And we think about things like passive measures, which are the fabric of the building, the fire compartment doors, the walls, the facades in that case. We think about the active systems. These are the fire alarm systems. What happened? What was the sequence? When was the first call to the fire service? How long did they take to get there? What were the initial decisions? And, how did that fire develop, and why did it develop more significantly? So it's not a new phenomenon, fire. It's been around since the dawn of time, and we shouldn't be having a situation like this now. I was absolutely stunned. So rightly, there's been a huge inquiry into Grenfell, but it's altered people's perceptions about, people get a perception about risk, and it changes when they see these things, and start to worry about, could it happen to them? And it has undermined people's confidence in things like stay-put policies, which we still need and have to have, because a lot of buildings don't have the capability to facilitate a single stage evacuation. Stay put is part of the deal, but it's undermined people's faith in these policies because they think it could happen to them. And actually, in a building that's built correctly and been properly risk assessed, then of course, we won't have that potential for fires to jump from compartment to compartment like that. So you said in a recent podcast that sometimes a serious thing has to happen to shake things up a bit, to stop us slipping into complacency. And I thought that thing had happened with Lakanal House in 2009. Which was a kind of gave us a warning that there was an issue around compartmentation, and now Grenfell has seriously put it on the map, which of course has resulted in the new Act, the Fire Safety Act 2021, which puts a duty of care on people who are responsible with in multiple multi-occupancy buildings to ensure that they have considered the building itself, in terms of compartment doors, the facades, and this potential for, we've got to mitigate or minimize the potential of fire to impact on those. So it's such a big problem. I think it's been pushed in. I think it was pushed into the too difficult to do drawer, because the enormity of the problem around the whole of the UK in terms of the impact of putting measures in place, the cost is absolutely astronomical to solve the cladding issue. So it's it has definitely got people looking, and I think the problem is, for me, is if you go for one barometer of when you're doing, if you refurbishment work or whatever, if you just look at price, then you're probably not going to get the right outcome. You've got to make sure you've got the right materials, the right approved risk assessors, and you've got to do, if you cut corners and you save money on these things, there's normally a cost to that, unfortunately. And it's had its impact. You know, I see a lot of risk assessors now who are a little bit nervous. I mean, I don't personally do fire risk assessments, but there's risk assessors that maybe are asking for a lot more to protect themselves.
Yeah.
On the basis that, you know, and giving people very, very tall bills to pay when actually you probably don't need to have those measures in place. But it's you need to have a good risk assessor. You've got that person has to be able to you know, have something that's suitable and sufficient. You don't necessarily need bells and whistles
Yeah.
and absolutely everything, but you do need to have certain fundamentals in place. So we've got to get this balance right between how much money you're going to pay for an appropriate level of you know, safety within your premises. So
Yeah.
it's an interesting one. It's a huge subject, you know, but yeah, interesting. I've been fire for 30 odd years. My particular interest is, you know, the human response
Yeah.
elements. That's thing that's always fascinated me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned risk perception just then, and that was something that we spoke about when we did our sort of pre-chat. So
Yeah.
let's kind of build on that, because that brings in this human element a bit more as well. So we spoke about sort of risk perception and then shortcuts. So how do individuals or perhaps organizations tend to misjudge, if that's the right word, fire risks?
Well, I think the problem is, and you know, as I always say about fire, it's a low frequency event, but high consequence, of course. And with anything that's low frequency, we tend to not be practiced at it, and we might not have that. You know, I suppose. You know, I always say, you know, if you're thinking about a risk, if you see a low beam, it's sat there in front of you. You can see, you know, someone could bash their head on that. With risk assessment, with fire isn't there at that point. So it's hard to try and visualize what its impact might be. For some people, it's just not even on the radar. But you've got to understand fire dynamics. You've got to think about what's the role of that door, what's the role of, you know, how would it perform? What if you had a fire here? Would that impact on anyone's escape strategy? I think a lot of people don't know anything really about fire, and a lot of people sit, you know, as where I call them the unconscious incompetence. Okay, these are people who don't know that they don't know,
Yeah.
and they just want to tick the box for compliance, and they will just say, you know, although the original guidance for the Reg Reform Fire Safety Order when it came in was there to you know, when the original guidance came in, the idea was the risk was going to be owned by the responsible person out there. A bunch of guidance documents were produced for the government. Say, look, you can access them online. You got to find out what type of premises you've got. Go and do your risk assessments. And I think the idea was, you go and get it right. There's a bunch of guidance documents. You take ownership of this, and you know, off you pop, kind of thing. But a lot of people felt that they were outside their scope of competence, so they would get an external assessor in. You come and do the risk assessment for me. A bunch of significant findings would be inside that folder. The folder would live on the shelf. Say, thanks very much for doing that. They wouldn't even look at it. And there's actually an argument to say it might be better to get somebody to attempt to do their own risk assessment and maybe do a 60% of a job, because at least they know what's in there and they've considered it, rather than having an external person come in, you know, look at the fundamentals, say, good grief, this door is risk critical. If you leave this door open, those people are going to be conflicted or compromised. And thanks for doing the risk assessment. And that person doesn't know about that door, just ends up wedged open for the rest of the time. So, you know, we want to, you know, it's a very hard thing to manage, but I think, you know, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, what motivates people to get it right? Is it a desire to want to, you know, to make sure that nobody dies or gets injured in the place of work, and they want to get it right because of a very strong moral compass? Or is it just about compliance? Is it a fear of prosecution if they get it wrong? And you'll get every different type of person out there. But I think protecting the fire is quite, you know, a lot of people are not thinking about it. It's not even on the radar because they think it will never happen to them.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that between the sort of carrot and the stick, as it were. I remember I did a survey of about 500 and something safety professionals, and I asked them, which resonates with you, and I can't remember the exact wording, but one of them was, I want to keep people safe in broad terms, and the other one was, I want to keep myself and my organisation kind of away out of trouble, if you know what I mean. So there was a positive and a negative. And within the safety community, it was overwhelmingly that sort of positive aspect that came out. But I think the challenge is that we might think that on the one hand, but on the other hand, the organisation and the boards and the leadership teams maybe don't have the same perspective. So we maybe need to be hitting both of these to try and achieve the right result.
And I think that's right. It's like everything in every single thing in life. There's every different type of person out there. I mean, we deliver training a lot, and we have to recognize that some people learn differently. Some people want to learn visually. Some people want to learn, orally or whatever. Or people need to have hands-on with things to understand them. You get different learning types, and I think it's a reminder for me. You've got every different type of person out there. And you can't have a one size fits all. You have to hit, all the different angles, and there's a place for carrot and there's a place for stick, certainly. One of the problems with fire, I suppose, I mean, I always like to use the term, to explore the term complacency. I think is and one definition of complacency. I've written it down. It's complacency occurs when you've been doing something one way for so long without incident that you assume there can never be an incident. It leads to a person's mind not being on the task, and it prevents people from trying harder. And that's true. That is, we had a really serious fire in Bolton about 12, 18 months back, a hot works accident. And the people that were doing the hot works didn't have an extinguisher with them. And you can, and it's when you do hot works, you've got to do a scene assessment, and then you've got to get signed off, everything else. And as a minimum, you need some means to fight fire with you. And I can just imagine somebody stood there saying, "Well, we'll just do this little bit of welding. I've got an extinguisher. Well, it's in the van. I've been doing this a long time.
Be all right. Yeah, be all right. Be fine."
And that's the problem is people get away with it. I don't really like to get away with it. People get away with an awful lot because they've never been tested. And I often say, I have to try and think about. It's very hard sometimes. You speak in a style that is, you might use jargon and stuff. So you've got to try and speak to people in a way that it lands. If I come into your premises with a single match and ignite one thing, is there a potential that somebody could become injured? And when we talk about injuries, the biggest injury is a smoke inhalation injury. We call it contamination injury. And those atomized droplets, although carbonaceous material, can often be carcinogenic, depends what's on fire, of course, but that stuff ends up inside your lungs. It's not good for you. I can set fire to one thing, which means someone's going to breathe some smoke in. You've got problems. You should always be able to turn your back on a fire or have a means to get out the premises without fire affecting that escape route. So it allows people to think, and some of the big things that jump up, things like single staircase conditions where you've got no alternative means to get out of the premises. Then, of course, you've got to keep it combustible free. You can't have a fire in the bottom of a staircase. There's many case studies. The China Lane incident in the 70s in Manchester, several women died on an upper floor after a single fire happened on the ground floor and took out that staircase. But people aren't thinking about it. And, I do think that when I go out, I see every different type of person. I get people, I'll arrive somewhere and they will say, "Oh yeah, we've been told we've got to do this." And you get some people are really excited about, we want to get it in, it's really important. We've got to get it right. They're the best audiences and they're hanging on you every word. You have to spend the first chunk of time winning those people over. A lot of people have to have that experience to absolutely recognize it is a thing. But a lot of people, and I say to people, some people have never phoned the fire service in their lives, never had a fire incident at work, but they happen every day. And they are like little pinpricks on the map. And people enter test conditions, and you will either fall into one of two categories once your fire event starts. You will either fall into the category of consciously competent, which means you've got a procedure and you will go through it and you will do it, but you've got to think about it, or you'll be conscious of your incompetence. So you suddenly think, my goodness, we're not prepped for this. And one of the funny things, I was thinking about, sort of your you're focused more like on slips and kind of things. And when an event occurs, it's happened, and at that point, there we go. We've got an event that's happened. We might obviously need an ambulance and stuff. I think with a fire, it's different to just an accident in that when it happens, it's not finished. That's the start of it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, it starts to escalate. And this is where your strategy kicks in. And honestly, the amount of fails that we see, you should not have buildings burning down in 2024, but it still happens. Poor strategy, poor training, poor communication, all these things. But I'm not going to bang the drum and chastise people for this, because they are polarized towards what they're doing on a daily basis. If you're a salesperson, you're going to be focused on sales. If you're a school, you're focused on meeting those targets, making sure all the syllabus is in place. You're focused on that. Fire's a peripheral plate that needs to be have a little bit of energy implied every now and again. Get that plate spinning. People aren't thinking about it all the time, but when it appears, it's the number one priority. Forget what's in your in tray. Now you're in test conditions, and invariably people fail that test for many reasons, which we can talk about. Human behavior. In fact, I mean, for me, it just you get almost this cognitive overload, too much information, and trying to compute what's happening, and you've got a shock thing going on as well, where you think, my goodness, and I have many times turned up at incidents, and you're speaking to the responsible person, and you have to speak in a very direct, assertive way to extract the right information out of them, and they've just got no headspace left. And you think, I recognize this has just come upon you, and you're trying to, come to terms with what's happened, and you're thinking about all those procedures. You maybe, we did some training about 18 months ago, and it's off the radar. And people wing it and try and get it right, but the usual mistakes are made. Yeah.
And is it something that people are consciously or unconsciously sort of taking shortcuts and just sort of doing the bare minimum, or what are some of the big?
I always think it's interesting because I think everybody has done something that has made something more efficient, and the compromise is health and safety. I need to put some deep proper health shoes on to do this task, but there's a hassle factor, and it probably won't happen. And actually, how much effort is required for the benefit? I had, we had an incident in Bolton. It's well publicised. So it was in a hotel in 2001. A couple of fatalities. You can read about it. It's in the public domain. But they got a really heavy fine after 2 fatalities occurred for the significant fire safety failings. But there was one aspect. They had beds stored in the corridor. Now I know why the beds were stored in the corridor, because it was more efficient for the housekeeping to handball into the bedrooms. But of course, now we've got a scenario where we've got potential for a fire to occur in a corridor, and that's exactly what happened. And that was an arsonist in that particular incident. If you chose to follow the hotel strategy in that case, you were going to be in serious trouble, because you would have to walk into a smoke-filled, non-untenable atmosphere on the corridor. If you stayed in the bedroom, the idea in a hotel is the bedroom doors are there to stop a fire getting into the corridor. That's where the risk is. But actually, in this particular example, the fire was happening in an escape corridor. People stayed in the bedrooms. The fire doors were working in reverse. They were stopping a fire coming from a corridor back into a bedroom. The couple that did follow or did what they were supposed to died because of it. And of course, although there was an arsonist involved, and there might have been a bit of sympathy for the hotel that, you did have an arsonist, but he set fire to combustible materials that were stored inappropriately. And actually that comes back to the hotel. So, and you can see clearly that the only reason those beds were on that corridor was because they'd made efficiencies, they were becoming more efficient. So, you are right in that you can apply it to everywhere. Why have you not got a hard hat on? Why have you not got a high vis jacket on? And it is often, hassle factor. It's too much like hard work. We're back to that complacency. It prevents you from trying harder. It's interesting.
You mentioned earlier that there are some trends that have taken place or are taking place which have kind of changed the likelihood and the frequency of fires. Do you want to just talk a bit about that? Because I think that's quite an interesting counterbalance to what you're trying to say.
I just think it's unbelievable the journey I went on, because in the 90s, you would be getting typically maybe 2 to 3 chip pan fires a week at my station. It was quite it was an area that was quite a lot of deprivation in the particular patch I was working on. There was smoking was a big problem in those days. Lots, smoking is just not a thing so much now. There's only pockets of smokers left, but in those days, smoking, typically you would drop a cigarette down the side of a sofa. You'd fall asleep, drop a cigarette down the side of the sofa. The smouldering cigarette would eat into the foam, and it would open up a cavity. And as that cavity was starting to open up and smouldering away, eventually what would happen is, as that cavity opened up, the cigarette would drop out the bottom. You would get this airflow traveling through this almost like a chimney effect, and you'd get the flames. Now, typically for fire investigation purposes, we put the smouldering phase down between 45 and 90 minutes. Now, what happens is, with a carelessly discarded cigarette, is that smouldering would produce carbon monoxide. And people would quietly be put into a deep sleep, and unfortunately, they would die of carbon monoxide poisoning before even the fire started. And in those days, smoke alarms people just didn't have them. It only became law in 1992 to have hardwired smoke detectors fitted at build stage for domestic properties, but it wasn't retrospective, this thing. So of course there was lots of existing building stock with no smoke detectors in. So a stealth-like fire that doesn't make any sound would quietly poison you. We used to get quite a number of accidental fire deaths which were attributable to carelessly discarded cigarettes. In those days, the pub would shut at 11 o'clock, and so would the chip shop at the same time. You look in any town now, there's a sea of takeaways, but the amount of people used to go home and then, put the chip pan on and then fall asleep, or they try and make some food. You can get your food fixed before you go home. One massive thing is the digital revolution. So we had, in our patch, we had lots of antisocial behavior fires. Car crime was quite high. But in those days, we would typically, our station would deal with 300 plus car fires a year, more or less one a night. But now CCTV, and probably the main thing is the digital age. People are so entertained now. You've got Netflix, you've got Amazon Prime, you've got multiple channels to go at, you've got social media. People are so entertained. You haven't got these hordes of people creating mayhem in society like we had in the 90s. They're just busy doing things. Children with matches was always a significant problem. So desire to go out and set fires has waned. But opportunism also has, because the only access to matches and lighters that a child would have would be because the parents would smoke. Now, those parents aren't smoking anymore. So, of course, the access for those young people to matches and lighters has gone. Smoke alarms, we had a huge campaign in the early noughties, probably about 2003, 2004, 2005. Brigades right across the UK would go out and fit smoke detectors, and they have been an absolute game changer. So people putting their own fires out now. People would get the heads up there's a problem, shrill beep of a smoke detector, whereas years before that would have evolved into a proper, a decent fire. And the other statistics tell us the tale. We would have, in my first year in the fire service, our station attended 265 house fires. You will not find a station in the land that does those kind of figures nowadays. It's just not a thing. We could go weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks without a breathing apparatus where you'd be wearing your breathing apparatus set more or less every week, guaranteed, more or less. It's certainly in our patch. So there's a lot of stuff that's happened, but we've seen lots of positives. So the statistics for accidental fire deaths are coming down. Smoke detectors, huge. But the modern threat, of course, and you'll hear a lot about lithium-ion batteries. It's a modern and new threat to us. And these things, if you get a battery fire, they get onto something called a thermal runaway. So lots of metals burn, things like magnesium, sodium, potassium, all this kind of thing. Lithium-ion batteries. If metal ends up on fire, think about a sparkler. Once it's ignited, it burns ferociously until it runs out of fuel. And we call it a thermal runaway. Now, what we've found is that these scooters, hoverboards, e-bikes, whatever, the natural place to charge these are in the hallway. That's where people put them on charge. They put them in the hallway of the house. And the hallway is your principal means for getting out of a premises. There's been a fatality in the recent days. They're literally, it's about, I can get a fatality if you spread them out evenly. It's about 1 every 2 weeks in the UK. Lithium-ion battery type fires where fatalities occur. Lithium-ion batteries have been the cause. These fatalities occur in about 1 every 2 weeks in the UK if you spread it out evenly across the year. And one of the things that I would say is that if you do have these things on charge, don't be putting them on charge, because that's when they seem to be at risk in the hallway. Put them behind a door. Have your doors closed. And the good thing about doors at home, actually, they're not as good as your work-based doors, which are thick, great big fire compartment doors, and you need direct flame impingement to get through these doors. What you'll find is you get some seepage, and the smoke will come around the edge of your domestic door, or the loss of integrity of that internal door will allow the fire detector to activate. And it means you can come downstairs and get out. So we talk about having smoke alarms fitted, keys available, and doors closed. And if you've got open plan living where your stairs discharge into the lounge or whatever, it's more important to keep your bedroom doors closed, but it will give you that time. So, and that, unfortunately, statistically, when you look at fire deaths, that's where people die at home. And interestingly, that's the place where no legislation applies. They're exempt single private dwellings. But it's just an advisory, really. So it is a problem to us. And I think at some point, something will happen in a work environment with a lithium-ion battery, and it will probably prompt some legislative change. I'm finding them on charge now in hallways and in stairwells, and I say to people, if this sets on fire, you're just going to get into thermal runaway, you're going to lose this area of the building, all this space here is going to be untenable. Is that going to conflict with anybody's escape strategy? And if the answer to that question is yes, you need to move it. And you can't argue it wasn't reasonably foreseeable. There's enough information about these things now. So So we've seen statistics right off, and then we've got this kind of new
trends.
And it's the speed at which these things grow. So it's great at getting early detection with the smoke detector that's going to activate. But if you've got and most fires would grow very slowly. You get the incipient phase, you get the growth phase, fully developed. The problem with lithium-ion batteries, it's straight into it, and it's
Yeah.
full motor very early on. And
Right.
by smoke detectors beeping, you've already lost a compartment to
Mm.
smoke. So
Mm.
it's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks for that. Really interesting stuff and some good things for people to go away and think about. Um, just quickly before we wrap up, you sort of wear two hats in terms of how you help people. Perhaps you could just explain kind of, if this is something people are interested in, those two businesses and what they do.
Oh yeah. So as you can probably, well, we're a training company. There's 5 of us on the team, and myself and 4 others that go out and deliver fire training. We're all ex-fire officers, and we do that day in day out right across the northwest, and deliver great fire training and get people to get their fire strategies in order, all that kind of stuff. But one thing that I've sort of found myself doing in the last 18 months was an absolute known issue in the world of fire. And that is trying to have the right people in the right place at the right time with the right information. Very difficult with hybrid working. And because we have flexible working arrangements now, and I think, well, it was already becoming a problem, but when COVID came along, it put the problem right. It was almost like the problem was injected with steroids. Businesses had to facilitate home working or go bump during COVID. And because COVID was around for quite a period of time, it bedded in, and a lot of organizations became their new way of working. Many jobs now are advertised. Look at CIPD data, that's something like 40% of middle management jobs, there is some form of home working as part of that.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to plan, and actually people aren't volunteering to be fire marshals in workplaces now, simply because they think it could conflict with their home working. And it's always been the same for many, many years, in terms of, certain person, right? You're going to sweep this floor. You're going to sweep this floor. You're going to be the fire alarm investigation person. You're going to be the person who is the head marshal. Actually, if you've got these fluctuations of staff, but how do you always provide this cover? So we've invented something new, or I have. I came up with a concept called what's an application. It's called Marshall Marshall with one L and then EY. And that the idea is fire marshal. It's having an eye on all the marshals. And what it is, it's an application that deals with that problem by allowing people to select a role or task digitally at the point of a fire event. Now, we talked earlier about that cognitive overload, too much information. The nice thing about Marshall Eye is if you select a role, you can program it so that it will display the correct information in simple form, and it will lead you by the hand. You can upload a sweep plan. You can put in there a PEEP, personal emergency evacuation plan, for a wheelchair user, or it might be some other specific, how to switch off certain machinery. But the idea is when this bolt out the blue comes, you can respond effectively and have a digital opt-in model. One of the brilliant things about the app is it will kick out a full PDF report, and there's no hiding here. Every job that was claimed, every job that was completed will appear digitally, and it will appear in chronological order, time stamped. We've built into it, so we've dealt with some of the existing problems, and we talk about things like cognitive bias. So if you get a fire alarm ringing, you only get one cue, which is the fire alarm ringing, and actually with no other information at all, you tend to fill the blanks in with what you think's happening based on previous experience. So for a lot of people, they might assume it's a false alarm. Well, Marshall Eye, you start an incident off, and you can literally see in the live chat, you can have a conversation straight away, and you can very quickly escalate things or de-escalate things. You can say, guys, it's okay, it's an air freshener on the ground floor. So as a fire marshal, instead of being in an information vacuum, you're now informed, and you can command and say, guys, we're not going out, it's an air freshener, they're going to be switching the fire alarm off shortly. Last year, unwanted fire signals cost the UK estimated £700 million. That's only one barometer of measure. It might be the service industry, unwanted evacuation of a concert venue or whatever, a hotel during a wedding. These things just are a pain when they happen. And this allows you to manage it much more effectively, quickly stand down or quickly escalate. And one final thing, just to finish on that. So, on the app, we have extended its role now to, when you start an incident off, you can add a sound to it and you can start different incident types because we recognize it had additional functionality. So if you need to source a first aider very quickly, you can just start an incident off. And because your sweep areas are already programmed in, you can say first aider required, ground floor, and then you can have a live chat with all the marshals. Now, they might not be the first aiders, but they're certainly going to be in communication, say we need to get an auto external defibrillator downstairs quickly or an EpiPen or whatever. Or you could do a lockdown in a school as an example. So it's exciting. We've got some really interesting clients on board for Marshall Eye, but we're expecting big things for that in the future. Yeah.
Fantastic. Great, Stephen. What's the best place for people to get in touch? Is it LinkedIn or the website? Or?
Oh, absolutely. Come and find me on LinkedIn. Connect with me on LinkedIn. We've got our website, which we've got the Marshall Eye website, which is www.marshall with one L -IEYE.com, and any emails that come from there, I'll pick them up. But certainly I'm on LinkedIn and always looking to expand my network with like-minded professionals like myself. So yeah.
Perfect. Good stuff. All right, Steve. Well, look, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Learned a lot and lots to digest and take away. And yeah, if you're interested in checking out what Steve does, then give him a follow and a connect on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thanks, Christian.
Right. Thanks, Steve, and thank you for joining Steve and I this week, and we'll see you next week with another episode. Cheers.
Cheers. Thanks, Christian.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.